Zachary Karabell traces the history of civil coexistence between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the new book, Peace Be Upon You. This talk from George Mason University in Arlington, Virginia, is about an hour.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I want to welcome you to George Mason University, the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and within that, the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution. We're very pleased today to have a guest whose research and most recent book fits so wonderfully into the mission of the center. Of late, the board of the center has focused the mission on reconciliation in the family of Abraham, and that fits perfectly into the theme today, and a very realistic look at the issue of coexistence, both historically and today, between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It's the philosophy of the center and of ICAR to consider the relationship between civilizations, peoples, religions, and cultures to be an essential component of questions of global stability, the environment in which politics and conflicts occur, and we're particularly interested in the deeper roots of both conflict and also coexistence and peace building. We're pleased today to have with us Zachary Karabell, Dr. Zachary Karabell, who's an authority on American politics, the global economy, and Middle East relations. Dr. Karabell was educated at Columbia, Oxford, and Harvard, where he received his PhD in international relations. Dr. Karabell has taught at several universities, including Harvard and Dartmouth. His most recent books include A Visionary Nation, 4 Centuries of American Dreams and What Lies Ahead, Parting the Desert, The Creation of the Suez Canal. He also wrote a book that was acknowledged in a widespread way for its incredibly important effect on the question of what's college for, the struggle to define American higher education, which should be relevant to people here. And also his book on the last campaign about the 1948 election. Zach's new book, Peace Be Upon You, The Story of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Coexistence, is published by Knopf, and it examines the forgotten legacy of peace between 3 faiths. In 2003, the World Economic Forum designated Zachary as a global leader for tomorrow, and he appears on CNBC, CNN, and Fox News, and has been a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Foreign Affairs. I must say that one of the things that's so attractive about Zach and I met at the World Economic Forum, I was so impressed with a person who's deeply embedded in a very realist approach to the world, and at the same time, in his writings, both in terms of business as well, I've studied some of his business articles as well, there's this fascinating combination between realism and vision of a better world, and the realistic reasons for focusing on the possibilities of civilizations living together, the precedents for it, and why the negative construct of that in terms of wars on terrorism, etc., are simply not acknowledging the full set of realities and possibilities in terms of global coexistence. So I want to heartily welcome you to our midst, and Zach will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes of question and answer. Please welcome Zach.
Thank you for that introduction, Mark, and thank you for ICAR and for George Mason for hosting this afternoon. When I tell people the topic of the book, and as you do when you write a book, people ask, what's the book? And I say it's about Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence. And the stock response seems to be, an awfully short book. Then I tell people the title, it's Peace Be Upon You, The Story of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Coexistence. And they say, what is it about? And I say, oddly enough, it's about Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence. Look, the simple part of this book and the simple fact of this book is that it is a history of the ways in which these 3 traditions have, over the course of 1,400 years, coexisted. That ought to be a relatively banal point, that there have been lots of times over the past 1,400 years where Muslims have lived next to Jews and Christians without killing each other. In that sense, I think there is a fairly low bar for coexistence. And that is an important point. This is not, as I'm sure, should this enter more of the cultural dialogue right now, be characterized as the Rodney King School of History. This is not the why can't we all just get along, and look at the ways in which there have been so many periods over the past where Muslims and Jews have walked hand in hand through the field celebrating the glories of life and the existence of God. That may be something to which we all aspire, but historically it is rare for different faiths, let alone different sects within different faiths, to actively embrace each other and celebrate difference. And so the history of coexistence is not the history of respect and concord, at least not in my view. It is simply the history of how do people that are highly contested in their views of what is the revelation of this same Abrahamic God, how do they live together without erupting into violence and various forms of discrimination and conflict, period. And that there have been multiple periods. In fact, the majority of time spent over the past 1,400 years has been spent without violence between these faiths. That is not a culturally familiar point, even if it's a historically accurate one. Now, the problem, of course, is that, particularly in universities, right, every course and libraries are filled with thousands of books over the course of the past century that chart the reality of this. This shouldn't be news to anyone, and nothing that I write about in this book do I pretend is new or original. This would not be a good dissertation, just word to the wise. But it is unfamiliar in our culture, and not just our culture, not just Western culture, it's unfamiliar in most parts of the Muslim world. The notion that there has been this kind of coexistence, and it has occasionally been fertile coexistence that has led to creation of new ideas or technologies or societies, particularly in medieval Spain or the Ottoman Empire. The notion of that is unfamiliar. I mean, as you know, teaching and as I've experienced with students, images of Islam in the United States have been, well before September 11th, largely about violence. And images of the West, whatever that means, Christians and Jews, the United States, Israel, call it what you will, images of the West in the Muslim world and in the Arab world have tended to be about aggression, domination, imperialism, control. And the effects of September 11th and the cascade of events in the past 5 years with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, violence between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, have only solidified those views much more deeply, but they were there before. Now, the reasons for historical forgetting are difficult. You know, why is it that notions of violence and conflict have rooted themselves so deeply in our culture and so deeply in Arab and Muslim culture, whereas notions of peace and coexistence have been so difficult to gain traction? I think part of this is simply human nature. You know, there's no sort of pernicious active campaign to forget. There is an element of this that is, peace is boring. You know, peace is not an interesting story. There are no novels about a happy family, and there is no history of peace. Because human beings don't relate dramatically to the absence of conflict. Every Shakespearean play is a moment of great conflict, and it may be followed by a moment of great resolution, but conflict is at the heart of drama. The entire endeavor of writing history, from the very first time someone sat down to scribble dynasties, is about birth, war, death, and marriage, right? All of which are, in their own ways, traumatic, particularly the last one. So the notion of history being about peace, about the living together, about the absence of that kind of drama is alien. And it's true in our world today. I mean, one of the points of this history is that it's not just an issue of historical forgetting of coexistence between the faiths, it's an issue of contemporary forgetting and contemporary overlooking, We're all aware of this with the local news, and the degree the local news continually focuses on the one murder or the 4 car accidents or the bad storm that's coming. It doesn't focus on daily life, because daily life as it is lived by most people is largely prosaic. It's uninteresting. And it's uninteresting in the past. John and Muhammad woke up in 11th century Cordoba. They each went out because they were farmers. They tilled the fields. They both prayed, to the same God in different languages because they were both concerned about drought. They broke some bread together. They did some more work. They walked home. They had a drink and they went to bed. Is not a good story. It may be the lived reality for most people for hundreds of years, but it's not interesting, at least the way we constitute interesting. Now, that may have particularly negative repercussions for the commercial publication of a book about peace versus the publication of a book about war, but it is, I think, part of the explanation. And again, it's a much more non-religious explanation for why it is we forget these things. The other issue about why it is that moments of coexistence haven't been as tractable as moments of war is that there is a tendency when people write about coexistence to go to the other end of the spectrum, to go to the other extreme. And if remembering only moments of violence, which again is what we do today, talk to anybody in the streets of Cairo or anybody in the streets of Washington or New York or Iowa or wherever else, and you're likely to get a sense that the history of relations between these phases is an unbroken litany of wars and conflicts from the time of Muhammad until contemporary Baghdad or 9/11, and to have very selective memory, if any memory at all, about the actual episodes. And that history is like reading every other page of a book. It's not inaccurate, but in skipping every other page, it creates a picture that is so distorting as to be fictional. The episodes are factual. The overall picture is not. The problem of books that and sometimes classes and messages and interfaith dialogue that seeks to inject the forgotten past and the moments of concord and the moments of coexistence is that they insert the missing pages and then remove the pages of conflict, thereby creating an equally distorted flip side of the picture whereby everybody was living together, whereby the glories of Cordoba was this golden age of the 11th century where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together and debated and thought, and there is no conflict. And that is an equally distorted reading of the past. And it is, I think, important to remember that not all coexistence is coexistence we may like. Someone at a talk told me the other day that they remembered a photo, and maybe you'll remember this better. I don't know if it was 4 years ago or at some point recently, where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish leaders gathered in Jerusalem jointly, religious leaders jointly, arm in arm, as it were, to protest against the prevalence of homosexuality in society. Now, that is an example of religious dialogue and working together for a common end, but it's not necessarily working together for the kind of common end that a lot of people who think about coexistence as a positive thing would celebrate. And I write about in the book that there is a lot of coexistence today, but it's not necessarily the kind of coexistence that people want. There's a lot of economic coexistence going on in the tourism industry in Marrakesh today between Moroccan business people and French tourism companies or U.S. hotel companies. And there is a lot of coexistence going on today in contemporary Dubai, where nobody cares what you believe and nobody cares what God you obey or bow down in front of. They care only how much money you have in your bank account and what condo you're going to buy and what deal you're going to conclude. And it is truly a glorious, decadent zone of coexistence that combines the best and worst elements of Singapore, Miami, and Las Vegas. But it is not the image of coexistence that interfaith dialogue and religious frameworks tend to hold up as a model, because it carries with it all these less attractive qualities in the view of what constitutes noble religious aspirations. So I want to take a moment and just dip into moments in the past of this kind of coexistence and then sort of circle back to Dubai in the present, and then we'll have some questions. The thing about the initial legacy of relations, and most of interfaith relations, whether it's coexistence or conflict between these phases, between the three phases, has unfolded in the context of Muslim societies. And it's why this kind of book will end up on Middle East history shelves, because while both Judaism and Christianity evolved earlier than and separate from the evolution of Islam, Islam both emerges with the full consciousness of the other two monotheistic faiths in existence, and just the way things emerge politically and geographically. When Muslims, Christians, and Jews interacted, it was largely in the context of Muslim societies. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, for 1,400 years, until the immigration of lots of Muslim immigrants into Europe and to some degree the 5 or 6 million Muslims in the United States, most interaction took place in Muslim societies, not in Christian societies, and there really weren't any Jewish societies after the first century to speak of in the way that we speak of political entities. So if the book is kind of framed by that, that's why, because that's just the historical circumstances of coexistence. And the narrative of conflict is often begun with Muhammad and the example of the fissure between the initial group of Muslims who follow Muhammad to Medina in the Hijrah in 622, and the result of the relations between the Muslims of Medina and the 3 prominent Jewish tribes of Medina, who were initially allied with the Muslims, initially allied with Muhammad. And that was a real moment of coexistence. So the so-called Constitution of Medina, where each tribe, each Jewish tribe and each Muslim and some of the Arab tribes who were kind of non-affiliated of Medina, agree to create a polity whereby each tribe will not interfere with the religion of the other, to each his own religion, was the guiding word of this, and also agree to come to each other's aid should any of them be attacked by an external force, presumably the Meccans in that case, but that it would be a kind of a collective self-defense group. And they formed a society, a brief society, whereby the religious freedoms or tribal identity was kept separate, but that they were going to work together for a common good. And then this falls apart as Muhammad becomes more powerful in the community, and the Jewish tribes in various ways resent that and want to fight that. And the result is the eviction of one of the tribes, the eviction of another one of the tribes with none of their property, and then the execution of all the males of the third tribe, and obviously the end of that polity. And that's been taken as a prime example of the inherent conflict between Judaism and Islam and the inherent violence of Muslims toward Jews. Which of those do you pick, though, as an exemplar of the mold? Do you pick the Constitution of Medina, which is this kind of multicultural confederacy, or do you pick the end game where it falls apart and it leads to the execution? The issue there, as with most of history, is that act a religious act? The notion that when Muslims and Jews and Christians fight each other, they are doing so because of religion and that their actions are therefore religiously grounded is something we really ought to question. So the fact that a group of Muslims kill a group of Jews may say very little about Islam and Judaism. And that's not an apology for the action. It's simply a fact. They're both tribal entities at this moment in time in 7th century Arabia. And one of the things that happen when tribes break agreements or undercut an agreement, it wasn't unusual if the outcome of that was war, conflict, and it wasn't then unusual if the vanquished tribe suffered the highest penalty, i.e. death of the males. That was not an uncommon event, not a common event, in 7th century Arabia, whether it was Jews or Muslims or Arabs or animists committing it. So the fact that it was perpetrated against a Jewish tribe is a historical fact, as far as we know, but may say very little about underlying attitudes of Islam toward Judaism or of Judaism toward Islam. The same thing about the Quran. The thing about quoting from the Quran, it's like quoting from the Torah or the Bible. I mean, you can find in the Quran any justification for any outcome that you want to find. So there are plenty of justifications in the Quran for peaceful coexistence between the faiths. There are also plenty of justifications in the Quran for not so peaceful coexistence between the faiths. And the famous one is, to each his own religion. There is no compulsion of religion. It's one of the famous verses of the Quran that you cannot force anyone to believe anything different, and nor should you, i.e. you cannot force conversion, nor should you. There is an injunction to treat the people of the book, the al-Kitab, the people of a revealed religion, in this case largely Christians and Jews, sometimes it includes Muslims and Zoroastrians. So verse 29 says, "Dispute not with the people of the book, save in the fairer manner, and say, We believe in what has been sent down to us and what has been sent down to you. Our God and your God is one, and to him we have surrendered. So clearly a message of respect and living and let living. But there are other messages that say that the message that was sent to Noah and Abraham has been corrupted, and that Christians and Jews are now ungodly because they got it wrong and they won't embrace the message of the Quran. So there, too, you have the joint legacy, but there clearly is a legacy of peace in there. Throughout the early Abbasid Empire, throughout the glories of Muslim dominance of the Near East and North Africa, you have many, many moments of what we would now call interreligious dialogue being played out, if not nightly, then frequently at the court of the caliph in Baghdad and then in Samarra. And so caliphs like Al-Ma'mun, who's the son of the Arabian Knights, Harun al-Rashid, calls in one of the leading theologians of the day so that he can debate with him the finer points of Muslim and Christian theology, the finer points of, was Jesus the Son of God or not? Is the revelation given to Muhammad a more accurate revelation or not? And these were real serious theological debates down to the nitty-gritty of belief and ideology and who believed what and what the comparison was. And it was a kind of a contestation, but done openly in a way that I think is very difficult to imagine today. I mean, Marc may engage in some of this today in parts of the world, but it is so much the exception than the rule for different faiths to debate one another, which is different than dialogue. Dialogue is the search for common ground. Debate is the welcoming of difference, and there was a lot of debate, followed by drinking and wine and dancing girls, because why not? And that was just part of the milieu of these environments, and went on repeatedly over the course of several centuries. One thing that you do get when you look at the past 1,400 years is the recognition of the notion of what religion and identity meant is obviously very different over time than what we currently think of it. So the notion of what religion is and what does that mean was much different at different points. And it was different in 9th century Baghdad than it was in 10th century Cordoba, and it was different in 15th century Constantinople than it was in 19th century Cairo. And that the idea that religion means one thing over the past 1,400 years is also, frankly, kind of silly. And just there are wonderful episodes that illuminate this, so that you get in medieval Spain, which is often held up, I think rightly, as this place where, Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted in places like Cordoba and Toledo and Valencia. I'm working on my the Castilian th. I always end up sounding a little like this. There was that kind of dialogue, but there was also a lot of war, and there was a lot of fighting. And one day Cordoba's fighting against Valencia, and when it's a Muslim city-state fighting against a Christian city-state, they could each hold up the banner of religion. So the Muslims could say this is a jihad against the infidels, and they did start using the word jihad, 9th, 10th century. I mean, it took a while, and it wasn't initial. And the Christians could hold up the, whatever they held up, whether it was the Bible or a cross, and say we're fighting for God. And so they would fight. But 2 months later, when they had made their terms and taxes were paid and somebody was defeated, and then there was another Muslim city-state a few hundred miles away that Cordoba also wanted to fight. And Valencia didn't like either. I'm just using these as an examples. I'm not using these as actual historical moments. And so they wanted to ally against this Muslim state. So a Muslim state and a Christian state want to ally against the Muslim state, which makes the whole religious ideology part of it somewhat ineffective, because if it's Muslims and Christians together fighting other Muslims, not even for sectarian differences, just because they want each other's land, the religious ideology doesn't work. So then it just becomes, they encroached on our lands. Their soldiers raped a woman. They burned some crops. We don't like them. They're ugly. They're mean. Whatever it was that got people to fight, they fought. And religion ceased to be part of it. So in order to say religion is the cause of conflict, because they were fighting one time Muslims and Christians, you then have to forget the fact that 2 months later they were allies fighting against someone else. And it's just indicative of the fact that the people will use whatever proximate excuse they need to use and can use to fight each other when what they wish to do is fight each other. And if religion's convenient, they'll use it. And if it's inconvenient, they'll use something else. That may be a grim view of human nature, but it's a different view of the role of religion in conflict. There's a fascinating moment in the history of medieval Spain when one of the Jewish leader of the Cordoban community named Hasta ibn Shaprut, who was very prominent in the court of the caliph in Cordoba, writes a letter to the head of the Khazar Turks near the Crimea, because rumor had that this group of Turkish tribesmen in the Crimea had converted to Judaism, which in fact they had. And they write back a letter, and it takes several years. And they engage in this whole dialogue about why did this Turkish tribe convert to Judaism, and apparently representatives, Jewish representatives, Muslim representatives, and Christian came to the court and all made their case as to why this tribe should convert. And at the end, the king of the Khazars was most convinced by the Jews, so he converted to Judaism. And they're both, the Hasta actually writes him saying, do you know when the Messiah is coming? Any word? And I mean, the only reason why I mentioned that story is it's such an odd one given our current context, where a Jewish member of a Muslim court in the middle of Spain is writing a letter to a Turkish tribe that had debated which to convert, that becomes Jewish, about whether or not the Messiah is going to come, and they're all going to move back to Israel. And clearly identity is somewhat different, and the notion of religion and society is not nearly as rigid as we conceive of it today. Another element that has been forgotten is, we all remember, in the United States have some memory based on Hollywood of the Crusades, Sir Walter Scott, all those great movies. It's a perfect example of the fusion of the sword and the word. Saladin has entered collective consciousness as the noble Muslim warrior. What's fascinating about Saladin is that he actually was fighting for religion. And yet he's celebrated in the West, which has always struck me as somewhat ironic, given the degree to which, we haven't tended to celebrate jihadists typically in the West. But that's really what Saladin was, except that his jihad was much more what in Islam is the greater jihad, the jihad for purity of faith, not the jihad against others. But in the pursuit of that, he was more than willing not just to fight against Christians who had invaded the Near East, but to fight against other Muslims who were keeping the community divided. And there are certainly some contemporary parallels today. There have been various groups that have used Saladin as an example in today's world of why they should fight against divisions within the Muslim world. Saladin has been used, like every other historical figure is subject to being used. But there were these moments of real concord in the Near East when Muslims and Christians and Jews weren't fighting. There was, decades and decades between these moments of crusades where there was war, just as there was in medieval Spain, but there was also living and let living, and there was intermarriage, and there was trade, as there was, again, in medieval Spain. And there was intermarriage, and there was more things going on because there were lots of laws that each of the community passed against those things. No community ever passes laws against things that aren't happening. So when a rabbi or an imam or a priest, rails against intermarriage and all of it, that's because people were doing it. Later on, one of the real moments that's interesting about coexistence was the Ottoman Empire, and the degree to which the Ottoman Empire was really a remarkable 500-year period where the Sultan cared not a whit about what his subjects believed and cared only that they obeyed him and paid their taxes. And once those basic parameters were established from the time of Mehmed the Conqueror in 1452 pretty much through the end of the 19th century, you had a level of religious freedom within the Ottoman Empire that the most libertarian Americans today could only dream of. I mean, real non-state intervention, really left to your own devices in your religious communities, to a degree that really was quite remarkable. Even when the so-called Jewish Messiah, Sabbatai Tzvi, rises up to overthrow the Ottoman Empire, right, and declares that he's the new Messiah and he's going to end the Ottoman Empire, until he actually marches on Istanbul, right? I mean, think of it, in geographic terms, he spends most of his time being shuttled along various Jewish communities, none of whom want him around because he's going to upset the apple cart. And so he's basically railing against the Ottoman Empire for 10 years in different parts of the empire. It would be like somebody today with an armed camp roaming around the United States, going from Iowa to Bismarck, North Dakota, to Utah, to Texas, with 500 armed people declaring that they're going to overthrow George Bush. Now, I know in a university setting that would also be quite popular, but and that the U.S. government does nothing about it until they actually enter the District of Columbia. That was Sabbatai's feat. I mean, until he marches on Istanbul, the Sultan's like, you know what? I just don't care. I just don't care. I've got wars I'm fighting in the Balkans. This person's no threat to me. He can say whatever he wants, and until he's an actual threat, he was left to his own devices. That's kind of indicative of the religious freedom of the Ottoman Empire and the degree to which faiths could kind of do what they want. So to kind of fast forward to the 20th century and the 19th, because it's clear that these moments of time where the live and let live have been deeply eroded in the past 50 years. You know, how did this happen and what happened? Part of it is that religious tolerance within the Muslim world, clearly, as it is in any part of any society, was at its greatest where those societies felt most secure. And to the degree that security has not been really part of certainly the Arab world and to some degree the greater Muslim world, but primarily the Arab world in the past 200 years, there is a relationship between greater intolerance and greater insecurity. And that's true in our own society. We debate within the United States post 9/11 this trade-off of security with tolerance, right? And while it may not be as acute here, you can see some of the same seeds. So to the degree that the Arab world was assailed literally by the same growth of Western power in the 19th century that the rest of the world was, and to the degree that that challenged autonomy and independence, tolerance was partly a victim of that, but not initially. What you have in the 19th century is a lot of joint belief in progress, and religion had nothing to do with it. Religion was everywhere in retreat from the West, from the Middle East in the 19th century, and had very little to do with the dialogue over the change of societies. That was the rise of nationalism. And I think the rise of nationalism and then the fall of nationalism in the late 20th century bears some relationship to the rise and fall of religious tolerance. I mean, one of the casualties of the failures of nationalism, and when I say the failures of nationalism, it just means, you know, for a long period of time from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th, what was promised was that the state would deliver spiritual and material rewards, kind of as religion had been promised to deliver them. And to the degree that the state, particularly in the Middle East, failed to do that, there was a lot of disillusionment. You know, the rise of Arab nationalism and the fall of it. You can sort of chart the rise of Islamic fundamentalism with the fall of Nasserism and Arab nationalism. This is really a 30-year phenomenon of the past 30 years, not a hundreds-of-year phenomenon. But even so, right, and we all know the narrative now, and far more people now know the name of Said Qutb than Said Qutb ever thought would know his name. But the degree to which that's what we focus on today, whether it's in the Middle East or the Arab world or the United States, is extraordinary relative to the degree of benign, indifferent coexistence that exists all around us. As anyone knows who goes to any part of the world, most people most of the time are occupied with their daily lives. Most people are occupied with, you know, do I have enough food? Do I have enough money? You know, what's my family doing? I'm annoyed at my son. I'm annoyed at my daughter. I don't like my parents. You know, whatever. I don't like my job. That's what occupies people. And again, that's kind of banal, but it's also fundamentally true. And to the degree that we overlook that in the present, you know, whether it's overlooking something like Dubai. And the reason why I brought up Dubai is, think of it. You've got a Muslim city-state in the middle of the Persian Gulf, 500 miles south of where the most intense violence is going on between Sunnis and Shi'is, and to some degree Americans, and therefore Christians and Muslims. And 500 miles away, you could be a world away when you go to Dubai, or you go to some degree to Bahrain or Qatar or these other places. You know, they've got $500 billion of petrodollars they didn't expect to have, not Dubai, but the area. And they're focused on developing that part of the world, developing for the future, economically integrating into the global economy. And so what do you make of the royal family of Dubai's private equity investment arm buying the Essex House Hotel and 280 Park Avenue from the real estate company Boston Properties, which is owned or controlled by, anyone know? Mortimer Zuckerman, who is one of the more outspoken supporters of Israel and donators to to Israeli causes, and he's perfectly willing to do business deals with Dubai, and Dubai is perfectly willing to do business deals with them. And if that's not Muslim-Jewish coexistence, I don't exactly know what is. The royal family of Dubai, wants to believe and be seen as a believing family, is also the majority owner of Kerzner International, the manager of resorts, the Atlantis Casino in the Bahamas. They're building a new big one on an island, floating island off the coast of Dubai, which may have the first gambling right off the coast of Saudi Arabia, and is majority owned and founded by South African Jews. So a Muslim family involved in gambling, drinking, and South African Jews. Also somewhat coexistence. The head of Orascom, which is the largest telephone company and cell phone company in Egypt, headed by a man named Naguib Sawiris, who's an Egyptian Copt who does business deals, just bought a huge Italian cell phone company, is much more interested in advancing the fortunes of his family than he is engaging in religious debate about the role of Copts in a Muslim Egypt or about the Arab-Israeli conflict. These things are all around us. They just don't quite enter our consciousness as part of coexistence, just like a lot of these moments in the past don't enter our consciousness about coexistence. And the only danger of this forgetting in a world where the ability of the state to control individuals and the ability of individuals to develop and obtain the means to do great physical harm is that to the degree that we think that history is destiny, and to the degree that we perceive the present as an unbroken link to a past of conflict, we then tend to perceive that the future portends conflict until what? Until Muslims become less Muslim, until Jews become less Jewish, until the U.S. becomes less American, but that there is a future of conflict that is deeply ingrained as opposed to a future of coexistence that is also deeply ingrained. And if anything, what I try to say in this book is that history is not destiny. History can tell us just about anything we want to see in it. And if we want to look for proof of violence in the present and future and its legacy in the past, we'll find that. If we want to see the legacy of coexistence in the past and in the present and the possibility of it in the future, that is also there to be seen. And that we ignore that legacy at our peril in a world where conflict is so much the norm. And that we would all benefit from a cultural remembering of this forgotten legacy, partly because it will help us envision a different pathway, and partly because it does more justice to the warp and woof of human experience and the infinite complexity of human beings in the past, in the present, and in the future than the more cardboard readings that tend to surround us ever will do. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and let's have some questions. So thank you very much.
Let's see. I think you have to keep it there. Yeah. Okay. I have many burning questions, and I think I'll start off with one, and then I'll open it up to the audience. I had a conversation recently. A few months ago, I had a conversation in Aleppo with very, very poor people and refugees. It was a very powerful moment between Jews and Muslims in that environment. But more recently, I had a conversation with a prince in the Middle East, and the main burning question he had for me was a very medieval one. Why cannot Jews accept Jesus as a prophet in order for all three faiths to have something in common? And it was shocking to me because I was trying to talk to him about having a massive revolving loan fund for poor Palestinians in order to compete with Hamas and also create more stability and coexistence and fairness and justice in this tragic Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what the Palestinians have lost. So I'm going to ask you, that was very depressing to me because what your book suggests is that there's a certain element of pragmatism that is possible for coexistence, but not without solving fundamental issues of fairness and justice that the United States did manage to do in that pragmatic approach to coexistence. So I'm not sure I understand whether the isolated Dubai models of a few wealthy families on top doing business with each other is the hopeful sign we're looking for, or the parallel to the medieval concept of coexistence. What do you have to say to what would be a pragmatic way in which these religions or their representatives pursue the question of global stability and conflict resolution?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is where do you look for sort of points of traction? You know, it's not trying to proselytize the message of pragmatic coexistence to people who are uninterested in hearing it. It's trying to emphasize the degree to which there are a lot of people who are, you know, particularly in the Middle East, and I cited a few, you know, one of whom is Egyptian. You could cite, you know, the same set of examples in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Morocco, in Tunisia, you know, on and on, in Iran. It's people who are, because of their own interests and their own passions, fundamentally uninterested in and rather tired of the constant framing of everything in terms of religious conflict. And, you know, you are much better than I in how do you deal with your interlocutors when you reach that kind of obstacle. You know, I want to talk about alone. Why are you asking me about whether or not the Jews will accept that, you know, Jesus was the one and only Son of God? What does that have to do with the discussion? You know, clearly one of the ways one could pursue that, although it may lead to nothing, is to simply say, well, you know, is that relevant to this particular issue? And if so, how? And how would you like it to be? And see what that person ends up saying. And you may find that it's a hopeless path with a person you're not going to find traction with. But that there are a lot of constituencies out there, certainly in various parts of the Arab and certainly in the larger Muslim world and definitely in the United States, who are much less interested in these in religious conflict than they are in problem solving, working together, economic deals, globalization, call it what you will. And that's as much a part of, and needs to be as much a part of, the way in which we understand what's going on in the world as any of these other things.
For people who have questions, please come up to the mic, right here on the right, and present. Who would like to begin? Professor Rubenstein, come to the mic, please.
The long walk.
The long walk. You can line up if you like.
Zach, thank you very much for that talk. And I want to say first that I totally agree with the emphasis of the book on coexistence being the norm, and violence and conflict not being the norm, despite the way history and the newspapers are often written. But I'm interested in how the norm becomes undermined, or what are the conditions in which a norm of coexistence becomes disintegrates and gives rise to the kind of violence that we're seeing too much of now. I'm especially interested, given the fact that when you describe Dubai, I thought to myself, listening to you, this is a recipe for violence. The Arab elite doing business with Jewish money on projects, gambling, and so forth, which the believers of all three faiths, some believers of all three faiths would consider wasteful and immoral, and so forth. Sounds to me like a script for Osama bin Laden to come and to do something to stop that. It's almost like bin Ladenist propaganda. So I was wondering how you see the relationship between the norm and the not norm.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the Dubai case, it's certainly true that there are aspects of that culture that are fuel and fodder for the most extreme fundamentalists and the kind of ideology they're fighting. What's intriguing is that if you go almost anywhere in the Middle East, Dubai is the model that everyone wants to be now and is kind of striving to create. And that has its own issues. But it's not just an elite. I mean, it's 1.5 million people living there who aren't citizens, coming from various parts of the Muslim world because of the opportunities it's drawing. It's much more like New York in the 1890s with all of its teeming inconsistencies and multicultural messiness than it is like anything else. And it's one thing to reject those things when it's them, i.e. the West and the imposition. It's another thing to reject them when it's something that people are sharing in culturally. And even gambling, as most of you know, in various parts of the Muslim world is not nearly as verboten as it is just scripturally. I mean, a lot of Egyptians love to play bridge, and they weren't always doing so with, pistachio shells. So even that is not, I think, as absent. I mean, the fact that certain types of material culture will always, until otherwise noted, create animosity and objection amongst kind of religious groups, and that's certainly true in the United States about the excesses of Hollywood and gambling and capitalism. But if it's more rooted in the culture, I don't think that's necessarily a recipe for violence. I just want to make one quick on your, that this has been the norm, to highlight that. Part of it is we do write history based on the frame of the present, and so this is a time that there seems to be a lot of conflict, and so we view history through that lens, and that's always been the case. History gets rewritten by each generation based on the present that we exist in. But it is certainly vital just to continue, even though it seems futile at times, to remind of that history, and that Sunnis and Shi'is fighting in Baghdad today is now depicted as, well, they've always fought, right? And as anybody knows, there was one moment in the past 500 years where Sunnis and Shi'is fought in Baghdad, and that was for a brief period in 1919 when the British came in and the Ottomans came out. And that's it. So talk about something that has not only not been the norm, I'm not even sure you could call it the exception. It's been completely not part of that history until recently. And there's a lot of that conflict that we now say is woven into the history that simply is not. Yes, Sunnis and Shi'is fought 1,000 years ago in Baghdad, but the Carolingians were fighting with the whomever 1,100 years ago in Europe. I'm not sure what that teaches us about contemporary European society, if anything.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This is Mr. Joe Monfil.
I'm halfway through the book and enjoying it very much. I've been working also on the concept of retrieving history as a way of falsifying or combating some of the most militant and polemical arguments today, particularly in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict. But clearly there's a lot of passion in the polemics. There's a tremendous fear of the renewal of anti-Semitism, the conflation of criticism of Zionism or Israeli policy with kind of organic anti-Semitism. There was a documentary that was shown in a few theaters in the country last year called Islam, What the West Should Know, that advanced the thesis that Muslims in America are part of a huge sleeper cell waiting for a signal to rise up and overthrow the government and establish the worldwide caliphate, which even the Vice President of the United States has been warning Americans about. And if and as you read your history, and your history shows how ludicrous the concept of reestablishing the caliphate is, because it would require agreement among all the Muslims in the world on one leader. But the passion's there, and your argument is very logical and rooted in history. But have you encountered some of these polemicists? Like the thesis that the Muslims in this country are waiting for the signal to rise up is kind of like the reverse of the protocols of the elders of Zion. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I have no expectation that any book or any speech or any talk will, either in and of itself or even many of them together, are going to change strongly held ideologies. And I say at one point in the book that reclaiming this history does not make the world whole. It is not suddenly going to convert today's jihadis from hate to love, nor is it going to convert people in the West who view Islam as a violent, primitive religion to see otherwise. It may, on the margins, get some people to reflect occasionally on their views, but people do not seek their views to be challenged. They do not look for their deeply held ideologies to be proven wrong, and they don't tend to listen to things that contradict them. So when faced with those sorts of views, I'm not sure how interesting or viable or meaningful it is to even engage that in a particular, debate, because I don't think, it's probably very interesting for an audience. G. Gordon Liddy went around the country with Timothy Leary, and they weren't ever going to agree with each other, but it made for really interesting theater. On the extreme part, I think the one thing is important to remember, and I think there is some tractability, is that until the past 40 years, it was much better to be a Jew in Muslim societies than it was to be a Jew in Christian societies. And I really don't think there can be an iota of historical debate about that, regardless of the animosity and problems today, that remains historically just true by any litmus: economic freedom, religious freedom, physical security. But in a world of kind of insecurity and conflict, ideologies will spread. The one thing I would say to that's important, and you hear this a lot, of hatred and prejudice being spewed from madrasas in Pakistan and Indonesia, funded by Saudi Wahhabi foundations, and that the trope is that we will now have a generation of ignorance and hatred spread, and in the West as well as in that part of the world. I think what people forget is that in 1988, if you'd gone to any school in the Soviet Union, you would have heard about the decadent capitalist West and how much it was to be opposed and fought, and it was terrible and awful. And 2 years later, every Russian wants a pair of blue jeans, a phone, a Coke, a Pepsi, a business, and to watch porn. And the ability of culture to form and dissipate really quickly is, I think, much greater than we think it is. That ideologies have this way of seizing hold of a culture and seemingly dominate it. And then they have a way of evaporating, as if it were a really bad dream or a really bad binge. And so the only comment I would have to some of what you point out is that as rooted as it seems now, it's entirely possible that we'll look back in 10 or 15 years astonished by how ephemeral it seems then, because culture does shift. It's just very difficult to know how, when, or why.
Alfred Farrugia, a PhD candidate here. I have read a lot about the tolerance of the Ottoman Empire towards religion. Apparently, they distinguish between the Latin Church and the Orthodox Church. Then how do you explain the changing of cathedrals and churches into mosques?
By the way, even the claim of the Ottoman Empire being a zone of religious tolerance is something that a lot of people in the contemporary Balkans would be just enraged at me for saying, and is not part of the collective memory of a lot of Balkan history. And I respect that framework. I simply think that the brutality of the Ottomans, and I'm not trying to gloss over it, this was a brutal empire, as were most empires, in the way they maintained order and security. I just think it had very little to do with Islam. I think it had a lot to do with empire. So to the degree that Ottomans went into villages and recruited people, i.e. forcibly took them from their homes, gang pressed them into the army, was not manifestly different than what the Austro-Hungarians would have been doing to the same groups of people slightly over the border, or any other imperial group would have done to their population who were largely in servitude. So this is not a claim that the Ottoman Empire was some sort of liberal notion of peaceful coexistence. It simply was that within the framework of an empire, what one believed mattered much less than things like security and the power of the emperor. And to some degree, the reframing and the recasting of churches as mosques was, first of all, rather selective. It was usually the main cathedral of a town or a city, like the Hagia Sophia, most notably, but also in Salonika and elsewhere. And was something that had been done by both Christians and Muslims over the course of centuries whenever one or the other retook a capital or a place. It was a way of really saying, this is mine now, as a powerful stamp of authority and domination. But again, I don't personally perceive that as a scriptural or religious thing. I see that as a dynastic imperial act that was done by all groups at all times, and therefore was a representation of power at its most naked and its most raw, more than it was a representation of Islam or Christianity. And the same thing being said about the Ottomans. So, again, please don't get me wrong about the Ottomans. This is not what a wonderful, warm and fuzzy world the Sultanate was. It was their violence and brutality was part and parcel of their imperial status and could be found in empires everywhere at all times.
I think we're moving towards...
I think we have time for one more.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, please.
A couple more, actually. 2 more questions.
Good. I'm going to wrap up.
My name is Ioana Ganeva, and you're right that when I listen about the Ottoman Empire and how you describe it as a peaceful coexistence, I get enraged because from all the history, I'm from Bulgaria, and from what I know, it was exactly the opposite, and I disagree that it was just it was a way to demonstrate that they were a powerful empire, but was also a way to actually convert Christians from their religion to Muslim religion, and that was demonstrated by collecting the so-called blood tax, which is taking little boys and raising them as Muslim, and after that they will go and kill their families and their brothers and sisters, and because they were in different religion. So the only thing I would say from listening to this presentation is that the reason why Jews, Christians, and Muslims have lived together in peaceful coexistence now and through the years, for me, is that they did it because they saw an economic reason. Really, wars have been done to show power and for economic reasons, and it doesn't, as you said, when the Jews, when the Muslims, so the Jews ask, the Christians ask, why would Jews don't accept Christ as a prophet? Well, religion is such a personal thing. We cannot force our beliefs on others, and obviously, the only reason we would communicate and be together is because economically is viable for all of us, like for Dubai, for the people who do business. Nowadays in globalization, we see that. But once, for example, the Palestine wants to take over the land of Israel, that is not feasible, and there will always be war, no matter what, even if the people were from the same religion. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I do recognize that that the view of the Ottomans from Bulgaria, from Slovenia, from Romania is not likely to accord easily with some of what I've said about the Ottoman Empire. And it's certainly true. The Ottomans recruited young children from villages, brought them into the Janissary Corps, which was the army, and converted them. And that's what you had to do. I'm just suggesting that that's more part of a dynastic building exercise than it is one that had a whole lot to do with religion, and that they were just as, the Turkish elite of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the 19th century, were just as brutal with the Arab Muslim populations that they ruled, particularly when those populations became less satisfied with that rule, where they could be, as they were with the Christian populations of the Balkans. And that one wouldn't know that living in the Balkans, because you don't sit around when you're being brutalized and go, oh, it's not really a big deal because they're being brutalized too.
I want to just conclude with a couple of thoughts and just say that I think the last question and the last issue raises an important issue about that's relevant to the New York Times picture of the anti-homosexual coalition that got the front page of the New York Times. I think it's not just that people like a good fight. I think it's not just that the media loves a good fight. I think it's also that many people living in liberal societies today have a history of memory of traumatization from religious intolerance, whether it be women, homosexuals, or anybody who was a minority in various places. So that there is this history of coexistence, but there's also an ambivalent history. And what's difficult for us in this field, and we can talk more about it, is that those same people in that anti-homosexual coalition had been working for peace in Israel, and nobody ever put them even in the back page of the New York Times. But the moment they came against the homosexuals, they got the front page.
Right.
And we joked at the World Economic Forum, imams, rabbis meeting, nobody cared. All the cameras were somewhere else. We should start punching each other. And then the cameras would come. So we have a challenge in terms of how boring coexistence is and how normal it is and how to normalize that in a world that does seem to like the entertainment of a good conflict.
Absolutely.
And a good fight.
And just as a concluding comment, to lower the bar of expectations. And I think, some memory of American history is useful in this, in that coexistence between different sectarian groups in early America was not the result of everyone turning around going, I disagree with you, but I deeply respect your right to have a different view, and I respect the difference. It was largely a product of different groups of orthodoxies living side by side came to the conclusion that they had the alternative of fighting each other and recreating the death and chaos of Reformation and post-Reformation Europe, i.e. chaos, or they could deal with each other. Later on, maybe ideologies of toleration and dialogue became more fostered because of the absence of actual armed lethal conflict. But that coexistence tends to begin in much more modest and much less glorious terms, which is, can we simply live side by side while potentially detesting each other without actually killing each other? And that is as much the product of early America. And in time, that becomes liberal and tolerant. But initially, the bar is much lower. And I think that's also important to remember in a world where we seem to be expecting that respect and love will break out overnight. And while that would be wonderful, I think everyone would agree it is highly, highly unlikely. So with that, I guess we are at the end.
Thank you very much all for coming, and welcome here to CRDC, ICAR, and George Mason University. And thank you very much, Dr. Karabell, for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Zachary Karabell is author of The Last Campaign, Parting the Desert, and his latest, Peace Be Upon You. His talk was